So we'll start with an overview of Barooshian and his work, presented by Michael J. Russo, Trustee and Curator of the Martin Barooshian Art Trust. He's an art collector, entrepreneur, and scientist, and also author of the only biography and catalog raisonné on Martin Barooshian. Barooshian was also his friend and father-in-law as well.
Thank you for the introduction. So I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about Barooshian's early life, touching on a few events that I feel really influenced his artistic developments. Barooshian was an American surrealist painter and printmaker, working primarily in an abstract, biomorphic style. He was born in 1929 to survivors of the Armenian genocide, which had a tremendous impact on his life and his work, but it's not one of the four things I'll be discussing today. He had a prolific 75-year-long career, and he was literally making artwork till the day he died in 2022. So despite real resistance from the New York art world in particular, claiming that surrealism was dead and that figures were unwelcome, he didn't compromise his artistic vision, but this really pushed him into kind of a strange liminal space from which he's now being rescued, including the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, recently acquiring 35 of his works. So he was always exploring and learning, so it's not a surprise that he has a really wide range of influences, and he really integrates honors and celebrates them in his work. And this is even just a partial list, but they include Armenian culture, Renaissance and Baroque art, mysticism, symbolism, cubism, mythology, pop culture, mainly comics and cinema, Blake, Picasso, Dali, Mata, Clay, and Gorky. And again, that is just a partial list. To just give you sort of an essence of who Barooshian is, I want to just give you a very brief quote from Susan Faxon, who's a curator at the Addison Gallery of American Art. She said that Barooshian is an artist whose sweep was wide and whose exuberance, inventiveness, and imagination and artistic commitment were boundless. So I wanted to start with an image. So this is really representative of the kind of work that Barooshian started doing in 1960. And I want to start here, which is really the end of our discussion, and work our way backwards. So the title of this work is Conquest of Space. It's from 1968. And it's fairly typical of Barooshian's self-described abstract biomorphic surrealism. And he really considered this his mature individual style. So as you can see, it's an enigmatic visionary landscape, has fields of biomorphic shapes that coalesce into figures and forms, and those figures and forms then interact in all sorts of ways. They're loving, they're violent, they're sexual. Some are just isolated and abiding. This piece has several characteristics typical of this period, and so first, it's really quite complex, and Barooshian jokingly referred to this as his maximalist approach in sort of contrast to the minimalist approach that was so popular in the 60s. So it has great detail, great density. He has a fearless use of color. So he also has a lack of traditional perspective, instead using layering and color push-pull to really get any sense of depth. It's rife with symbolism, personal, mystical, and mythological. And he really, in essence, is trying to explore universal truths, have questions about human existence, and certainly approach even a level of transcendence. He's always celebrating nature in the natural form, but ultimately they are just invitations to the viewer to spend time and explore the works for themselves. So if we're going to impose anything, I'm always reluctant to any meaning or interpretation of this work. He certainly is looking at exploring the transcendental aspects of the exploration of space, what it could mean for humanity, what it could mean for Mother Earth, and then, in addition to that, trying to understand what are we really exporting out into space, potentially more war, empire building, and that's actually some of the kinds of conversations that were being had by governments at the time, like what do we do when we go in space. So my question is, however, how did he get here? And so I wanted to just really oversimplify his life down to these 4 points, his early life. Really, the first great development that happened for him in his art really was 1952 to 53, when he embarked on a year-long educational tour to Europe and the Middle East, courtesy of the Whiting competition, which he won. And there he really encountered the full breadth of the art historical timeline. It was something that he was fairly limited in, being just in Boston and making some travels to New York. And most importantly, it was the first time he saw the work of Arshile Gorky in person right here in Paris. He also had the opportunity to work in a variety and learn in a variety of workshops worldwide, but I think one of the more important ones was the time that he spent at Atelier Jean Pons, where he was really exposed to the vanguard of French and Russian modernism. So he went back to Boston for a few years, and then found himself back again here in Paris at Atelier 17, which provided him with a really experimental environment of international artists. And really, most importantly, it's where he learned color viscosity etching, which became extremely important, both as a printmaking process, but also to his overall, I think, art-making process. So then in 1958, Barooshian moved to New York City, the New York City area. And then by 1960, he had started his position at the Pratt Graphic Arts Center, which was really one of the most important places in New York for artists to gather at that time. And so there he befriended people like Motherwell and Hockney. He taught Barnett Newman how to make prints. And then he became particularly close to Willem de Kooning. And around the same time, Barooshian also adapted his painting formula in a way that he felt really finally would allow him to get the visions that were in his head onto canvas. So this is taking us back now to 1951, where Barooshian was really concentrating on paintings, woodcuts, and lithographs. These are fairly typical for one of the styles he was working in at this time. If you look at the piece on the left called Approaching Storms Colored Woodcut from 1951, it is, it's quite simple. In both color and form, quite contemporary for the time. It's certainly Gauguin inspired to some degree. It's an Edenic scene of two young people sitting on a beach, and she's looking off into the distance at the coming storm, which is clearly shaped like an atomic mushroom cloud. And so this is certainly Martin making a statement about the horrors of the use of the atomic bomb, probably something about our loss of innocence by use of the atomic bomb, etc. So on the right is a painting from the same period, which I really won't get into. I just wanted to have it there for completeness, so you have an idea of what he was doing with the paint at that time. So in 1952, found Martin traveling again through Europe and the Middle East, and there was a drastic change in his art. If you see the piece on the left is Looking from Faust, a color lithograph from 1953. He actually completed this while at Atelier Jean Pons. He really completely committed to abstract biomorphism at that point. And he said that this was the first really successful piece he did in this manner, and to quote him, he said, "I never looked back." The piece on the right is from the same period, Garden Delights, the woodcut from 1954. And the two things I'd like to point out about this. One, the biomorphic shapes are quite large, quite simple, and so compared to the rest of the picture plane, there's a lack of density that we will see later in his work. And secondly, this is the first time I start seeing Barooshian starting to really develop his own visual vocabulary, because you'll see this exact kind of composition repeated throughout the next 50, 60 years on occasion in his works. So, this is a painting, again, from the same period, and I just wanted to point out that it not only did his prints sort of make some movement forward towards greater abstraction, so did his painting. So this is Tiger Tiger. It's actually an homage to William Blake, whose work he saw at the British Museum on the same trip. And it is really somewhat more dramatic use of color, quite a dramatic use of black. And I would just point out the dynamic movement in the deconstruction of the body of the tiger. So in 1956, Barooshian then found his way to Atelier 17, and this changed how he made prints. He really started moving away from woodcuts and lithographs almost completely, concentrating almost entirely on color viscosity etchings from that point forward. So this piece was finished at Atelier 17 and printed at Atelier 17. And again, I'd like to just point out a few things that transformations from the previous. His line is getting much finer, much more refined. The biomorphic shape's smaller, more complex, and so the effect is that the entire composition increases in complexity and density. I would also like to point out some of the additional vignettes that are sort of positioned around the picture plane. This is something that, again, started emerging at this time that Barooshian would do recurringly in his works. So this is a painting from the same period. And again, for want of time, you can see that his painting treatment is becoming more expressionist. The surface is far more textured. The biomorphic shapes still, again, are getting more increasingly complex. There's greater density in action, and there's certainly a sexuality that's starting to come through in his work more directly than it was before. And this is another piece from the same period that I just wanted to point out what I spoke of a moment ago. This is sort of where he starts punching windows into other realities as a secondary composition among the sort of main composition in the foreground. So this brings us back to sort of where we began. So from 1960 on, as I said, this is the kind of work that Barooshian was doing. His line is much more complex, beautifully painted, individual biomorphic fragments, and he introduces a kind of a hard edge to them, which is different than the previous sort of more painterly approach. The surface still it becomes highly buttery and textured when up close, but from far away, the biomorphic shapes sort of recede into the figures themselves. So this is titled Revelation. It's from 1960, and it's fairly straightforward telling of the Christian Bible's Revelation book, with some components. For example, on the right, we see an angel blowing a horn. On the lower left is some supplicants. In the center top, the moon is turning to blood, and in the lower left, the sea is boiling and the sea is dying. So this is another work from the same period, but this one is far more enigmatic and less didactic. It's called Themes from Venus Flytrap. It's 1965. And so we see biomorphic shapes kind of floating in from the top, bubbling up from the bottom. There are several figures sort of marching along a diagonal from the upper right. And I just want to point out, if you can see, sort of center line left top, sort of the top left quadrant, there's a horse head. And that is no doubt a reference to Fuseli's Nightmare. And this is something that Barooshian also did consistently throughout his work. He would, to use a modern term, he kind of had Easter eggs, I guess, but he would take work by other artists who he really honored, and he would absorb some of their constructs somehow into his own vocabulary, and you would see them make appearances in this way throughout. So this is the last painting I'm going to be showing you. This is a little later, it's from 1979. It's called The Homage to Rubens, Venus and Adonis. It is essentially Barooshian's reimagining of the famous painting Venus and Adonis by Rubens, and he sort of strips away the top layer to see what lies underneath. The one thing you notice immediately is that it's much brighter. There's much more pastel kind of coloration in it. It's a bunch of probably 3 horizontal panels with some vertical figures overlaying them. There's 4 suns. I'm assuming that the 4 suns are more representative of a sunset than a sunrise, considering Adonis is about to go off and get himself killed by a wild boar. In the upper right is some musicians in their own little world. But if I call your attention just to the Venus figure, she's every bit the fertility goddess, with a pelvis that's just blooming with flowers and kind of doubles as a butterfly. But if we instead look at Adonis, who's solid and he's masculine, he's well drawn, but he replaces the lower 2/3 of his body with a phallus. So I think that's personally both poignant and hilarious, and I think it just shows that Barooshian certainly had a sense of humor, and it does come out on occasion, even if more subtly than this. So Barooshian worked in a variety of styles after this period. I refer you to the website if you want to kind of take a look at those. But I really wanted to include something about the color viscosity etchings that he started making in 1961. So he first spent time at Atelier 17, learned the basics of the process, and continued to innovate, and really became one of the most important masters of this technique. He worked on a zinc plate, which he would treat in extremely complicated ways with combinations of hard ground, soft ground, and aqua tint. He would then painstakingly ink them in both oil and watercolor inks so that you could produce a polychromatic print in just one pressing. And this work is My Age Minor from 1965. And then the final work I will show you is, again, in the same period from 1960 to 1970, Barooshian was making monotypes, painting directly on a zinc plate and pressing those through the printing press. He made probably about 250 of them. And it just to show you the contrast to the work he was doing on canvas, which was somewhat more tight and more deliberate. These gave him the opportunity to be more loose, experimental, and automatic. So if you want further information, I would refer you to my book or our website, martinbarooshian.org, or feel free to contact me at russo@martinbarooshian.org. Thank you.
Next up, we have Harvard Field. He's the managing director of the Arshile Gorky Foundation, as well as a writer, art historian, and catalog raisonné scholar. In his role at the Gorky Foundation, he's researched extensively on the life and work of Arshile Gorky, and also curated the exhibition Arshile Gorky Beyond the Limit at Hauser and Wirth, New York. He's also the co-editor of the Born Digital Arshile Gorky Catalog raisonné, which is at www.gorkycatalog.org. And he's going to talk about biomorphic surrealism.
Thanks, Rebecca. All right, I'm going to read from one computer and flip from the other because I unfortunately did not print it as I usually like to do. So bear with me. All right. Reflecting on his life as an artist, Martin Barooshian once stated that he read everything I could get my hands on. Excerpted from a late-in-life interview, the statement foregrounds the importance of artistic and literary sources in Barooshian's long, studious, and productive career. Far from an autodidact, Barooshian was highly educated in the history and technique of making art. He explained, quote, "For me in my development, all of art history across all techniques and media were relevant to who I wanted to become. His oeuvre, therefore, is intertextual, often referencing by title and imagery, literary allegories, and artistic homages. Almost always, his references are to the past. As Michael's indicated, biblical verses, William Blake, the old masters of Quattrocento and Cinquecento Italy, and the 20th century New York-based painter Arshile Gorky are among his most frequently cited sources. In one drawing from 1960s, Barooshian explicitly references works by Botticelli, Raphael, and Titian. But Barooshian's art historical source hunting was not just regulated to playful works on paper, such as this. These drawings served as studies for his large-scale paintings, such as To Giorgione of 1968, an abstraction of one of the Italian painter's adoration scenes. Yet, the painting is so unlike Giorgione's that one might feel compelled to rebaptize it to Gorky by dint of its drippy, turpentine-diluted oil paint, brushy handling, and biomorphic shapes that call to mind Arshile Gorky's work from the 1940s. And then we have a work by Gorky from the 40s, side by side with Barooshian's to convey that point. Barooshian also made one of those two, a homage to Gorky in 1970. Here that is. And again in 1982, a second homage, Requiem for Arshile Gorky. Multiple references exist in a single Barooshian artwork, but in grappling with his many artistic and literary influences, Gorky's emerges as one of the strongest. My presentation, therefore, will trace the trajectory and outcome of Barooshian's self-study of Gorky's oeuvre, from the early 1950s, when Barooshian first encountered Gorky's work, to the early 60s. That is, from the moment in 1953 when Barooshian first created his full-fledged, quote, abstract biomorphic surrealist work, to the early 1960s when Barooshian alleges to have finally penetrated, quote, Gorky's soul. Martin Barooshian first encountered Arshile Gorky's work in the form of a slide projection in a dark classroom at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Barooshian, only 21 years old at the time, was a precocious student in his final year of study. It was 1950, Gorky had been dead for 2 years. The Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, where Gorky's first retrospective was in the process of being organized, was scouting Boston as a potential traveling venue. Unbeknownst to Barooshian, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston shot down the Whitney's proposal to host a traveling exhibition. Quote, "The reason for the Institute's failure to participate had nothing to do with the quality of Gorky's work," explained the museum's director, James S. Plout. It is rather that in the opinion of our executive committee, the Boston public has not yet reached the degree of sophistication which makes it possible for the Institute to display a full-scale projection of abstract painting by one man. The director added, "I fear that the subtle nuances which distinguish each of Gorky's paintings from one another are lost, as far as our public is concerned, on all but a few of the initiated." Although New York was only about 225 miles from Boston, to Barooshian, a quote could have been thousands. His recollections from this period of his life in Boston confirm the resentments of the Institute's director. In the essay accompanying Barooshian's catalog raisonné of hints, author Michael Russo described the hostile, aggressive, artistic climate of Boston. Quote, "Barooshian found the critiques of these Boston expressionists of the School of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston extremely traditional, conservative, and almost useless. The Institute of Contemporary Art was better, for at least there Barooshian could see some examples of modernism, for example, the works of the German expressionists. But in general, the Boston art scene seemed, quote, stagnantly old-fashioned to Barooshian. His attitude calls to mind Arshile Gorky's own rejection of the Boston art scene as a young 20-something. Dissatisfied with the regional art climate, Gorky moved to New York in late 1924. 20 years later, in an ironic circular chronology, through the introduction of Gorky's work, Barooshian found a new, freer type of painting than what he was witnessing in Boston. In the words of ICA director James Plout, Barooshian quickly became one of the initiated. The polymorphous imagery in Gorky's work immediately delighted Barooshian. The compositions and the way Gorky painted his pictures were quite impressive, he recalled. Barooshian's teacher showed slides of all the latest painting from New York, but it was not Jackson Pollock's or Mark Rothko's paintings with their innovative drips and veils that intrigued Barooshian. Rather, it was the ability to, quote, distinguish some sort of imagery in Gorky's paintings in conjunction with their abstractness that pulled Barooshian in. Barooshian traveled thousands of miles to Paris before he first saw work by Arshile Gorky in the flesh. Indeed, New York was effectively an ocean away from Boston, for the exhibition American Vanguard Art for Paris debuted at the Sidney Janis Gallery in New York in late 1951. But it was in early 1952 at the Galerie de France in Paris, under the banner Regards sur le peinture américain, that Barooshian first encountered Gorky's artwork in person. And here we have the New York version of the catalog, the exhibition record in the Gorky catalog raisonné, and then here we have the French language version of the catalog, which would have been the one Barooshian had access to. Among first-rate works by de Kooning, Philip Guston, Pollock, Ad Reinhardt, and Rothko, the Parisian exhibition of the newest American paintings included Gorky's Composition Un Brut d'Oeil of 1943-44 and Passage à la Table of 1945. The latter, which Gorky gave the English title Landscape Table when it was first exhibited in New York in 1946, is now in the collection of the Pompidou here in Paris. Right now, one can retrace Barooshian's first encounter with the painting by visiting the Pompidou Surrealism exhibition, where it is currently on view. Landscape Table is enigmatic yet illusory, offering up the kind of imagery that caught Barooshian's eye during the slide lecture of his student years. During the period when Gorky created Landscape Table in 1945, he was building images by alternating applications of line and color. Usually the final layer would be line, thereby retaining the semblance of graphic imagery amidst the gestural brushwork and expansive swaths of color. The line work in Passage à la Table, Landscape Table, is contrasted to the more abstract, non-imagery of de Kooning's Gansevoort Street or Guston's Painting No. 5, both completely non-objective paintings that were also included in the exhibition at the Gallery de France. More than handling and technique, it is Gorky's compositional structure and style of line that most impacted Barooshian. He immediately identified Gorky as a surrealist, and it follows that Barooshian also began self-identifying as a surrealist. In 1953, immediately after exposure to Gorky's work at the Gallery de France, Barooshian made his first full-fledged, quote, abstract biomorphic surrealist work. As exemplified in the print My Heart is a Sunflower from 1954, Barooshian's imagery became curvy, organic, and abstract. For the next 30 years, Barooshian worked almost exclusively with biomorphic shapes, such as these. With few exceptions, his compositions from this period never fully abandoned representational references. Throughout his work, particularly his paintings, Barooshian maintains forms suggestive of the human body. In Bronco Rider from 1956-61, and this is a print, Barooshian uses florid, curvilinear shapes to render a cowboy on a horse. Dozens of works by Barooshian showcase the same approach to the human body. Examples of other prints include Boxers and Wrestlers, both integro etchings from 1961, and Dante's Inferno, an ink drawing from the same year, also depicts the human body like a fractal, akin to a body adorned with tiny scales for skin, or like the vegetal faces of Giuseppe Arcimboldo's bizarre portraits. But in a different perspective, Barooshian's figures are bodies without skin. His figures, at once flayed and adorned, feel surrealist. They also have surrealist roots. In the mid-1930s, Gorky and his friend Peter Busa dined at a restaurant in downtown New York City. On the back of a menu from the Irving Place Pharmacy, Gorky drew in pencil a flayed human figure and gave the drawing to Busa, who, 2 decades later, would become acquaintances with Barooshian. I'd like to suggest that this drawing could have influenced Barooshian, and if not this doodle specifically, then perhaps any number of the similar drawings Gorky made throughout the 1930s. Gorky here is one of the sources for Barooshian's figurative style, and for Gorky, the source was Surrealist. Gorky's relationship to Surrealism is often linked to chronology, namely the years of World War II that brought the European Surrealists like Max Ernst, Yves Tanguy, and André Breton to the countryside in Connecticut. But in truth, Surrealism extends earlier into Gorky's career. Rather than absorbing the movement through the key players themselves, in the 1930s, Gorky picked up Surrealism through Surrealist sympathetic galleries in New York City and through the many Surrealist journals and publications in local circulation. His library is replete with Surrealist texts and catalogs from the 1930s. The brief, yet everlastingly influential ethnographic Surrealist journal, Document, of which Gorky owned several copies, included a number of reproductions that directly influenced his work. Michael Larrey's 1930 article, The Home et son Intérieur, published in the second volume of Document, included illustrations of 3 exquisite anatomical drawings by Ami Bourdon. Dating to the second half of the 17th century, concurrent with the dawn of the Enlightenment, Bourdon's drawings of the human figure are detailed and educational. They are écorchés, depicting the human body without skin, to highlight its musculature and circulatory systems. For Larrey, a surrealist anthropologist, the drawings served as visual companions to his attack on society's idealized notions of the human body. In terms of their graphic import, Larrey lent a new surrealist appreciation to the drawings, describing Bourdon's figures in terms of calligraphy and graffiti, snakes and whips, and an apotheosis of anvils of bruised flesh and disgusting sparks. I will quote Larrey's passage at length because this is a surrealism conference. but bear with me because, it's poetic. In these anatomical plates, we see, for example, flayed skin, or a man holding either a head under his arm, or an ear between his thumb and index finger, or even a woman half flayed standing in front of a nervous system, her head open like a Minerva, her hair falling down, while an abundant circulation of vapors is established between her mount and her feet, and a multitude of drops of sweat bead a little everywhere on her naked skin, barely distinct from the tears that spring from her eyes. And we will understand why such representations of the human body, which show us either its secret mechanisms, both fascinating and fearsome, or one of the most critical moments in its history, that of aging, are more beautiful and more erotically touching than all those that painting claims to give us when it attaches itself to the production of nudes, academic or tormented, but which never give us anything of the true mysteries of human nature. Although Gorky did not read French, he was nonetheless incredibly excited by the illustrations in Lurie's article. So much so, he created dozens of drawings, refining the theme of the écorché, and directly incorporated Bourdon's drawing into several of his compositions. So these two illustrations are both from Document, and on the right we actually have a scan there of Gorky's own copy of the issue of that journal, and you can see an example of its much adored fact is the ink blot on the lower right of the page. And then here are a couple of Gorky's drawings, directly derived from that Bourdon, écorché, and then another example of that écorché figuring into his own work. Barooshian's écorchés, as seen in the intaglio prints, reappear in his canvases. The Venus figure in his self-portrait at age 40 with Venus and Friends, which is on the right, is vaporous and écorché-like. In Barooshian's 1982 painting, Homage to Gorky, the figure in the upper left, on the left there, is similarly posed instead of loosely interlocking muscular shapes. In 1978, Barooshian returned to the subject of wrestlers, this time depicting the gruesome battle in oils on canvas like medieval cloisonné. In Story of Adam and Eve from 1960, Barooshian pushes muscular articulation to the extreme, obliterating the human form in a manner grotesque and decorative. What I hope these artworks demonstrate is that Barooshian's long transference with Gorky's work manifested in a mannered style of biomorphic painterly abstraction. Specifically, that Barooshian's biomorphism is anatomical and related to the tradition of the écorché and its surrealist enchantment à la Lurie. Barooshian's transference with Gorky extends to the biographical, too. Although Barooshian did not know it in 1953 when he first saw Gorky's work in Paris, when he later discovered that Gorky was an Armenian-American artist, it, quote, only solidified my kinship to Gorky and his vision. Barooshian and Gorky, two diasporic Armenian-Americans, indeed have much in common biographically. Both families originally hail from historic Eastern Armenia, what is now Turkey, and in Armenian custom, both artists were named after their deceased grandfathers, Martin, and in Gorky's case, Manuk. Both grandfathers died in massacres wrought by the Ottoman Turkish army. Gorky survived the Armenian genocide, eventually finding passage through Ellis Island in 1920. He first moved into an Armenian community in Watertown, Massachusetts, not far from the similarly minded Boston suburb, where Barooshian was born in 1929. But by the time of Barooshian's birth, Gorky had already left. He had also already left his name and Armenian past behind, moving to New York with a new name and a new identity. The Georgian-born painter Arshile Gorky, cousin of Soviet writer Maxim Gorky, former student of Vasily Kandinsky at the Julian Academy in Paris, and a devout modernist painter. Only the last bit is true to Gorky's actual biography. He never stepped foot in France. But the attitude of self-mythologizing is entirely Gorky's own. In this regard, Barooshian and Gorky begin to diverge. Take, for instance, the two artists' relationships to William Saroyan, the famous Armenian-American playwright who was a prominent contemporary of both Gorky's and Barooshian's. Saroyan's plays about his Armenian ethnicity, childhood, and immigrant life call to mind Barooshian's own early print series, Thoughts on the Mind of a Young Armenian. Barooshian honored this influence with the portrait of Saroyan from 1986, illustrated here, which he made 5 years after Saroyan's death. Gorky, however, was uninterested in this direction taken up by Saroyan and later Barooshian. Curator Harry Cooper recently wrote that unlike Semirjyan, whom Gorky disdained as a, quote, professional Armenian, Gorky did not give his nostalgia a place or a name. Gorky kept his memories and ideas of Armenia and his Armenianness close to his chest. The difference between Barooshians and Gorky's relationship to their shared ethnicities is perhaps typical of the differences between first generations and immigrant/refugee generations. Gorky's own nephew, a first-generation Armenian American born in the Boston suburbs, sought to make well-known Armenian history of Gorky's identity that Gorky himself tried so desperately to leave unsaid. Barooshian's relationship to Gorky is marked by similar tendencies to read his paintings in terms of a, quote, rich personal vocabulary that speaks universally. It reminds me of William Rubin's iconographical reading of Juan Miro's The Catalan Hunter, now famous, in which Rubin inventories, identifies, and interprets every motif in such a way that, frankly, I think kills the painting. As Rubin remarked, Miro in Paris, like Gorky in New York, was weaving fantasies about the distant landscape of his youth. However true this may be, I think one must resist such positivistic iconographical readings that easily map onto an artist's biography and in turn an artist's nationality. It is ironic in this way how Surrealism's international success, the topic of much attention in recent years, lends itself to nationalist appropriation. Whatever the idea of Armenia meant to Gorky, it was not something that he could easily point to on a map. And that's that.
So now I'm going to do my own introduction. My name is Rebecca Alvin. I'm a independent filmmaker and writer, and I'm also associate teaching professor of media studies and film at the New School in New York. But I'm here wearing my filmmaker hat. I am in the process of making a documentary about Martin Barooshian. There's never been a film made about him. And I first came across his work through Mike, who knew I was very interested in surrealism, and I was just blown away by the paintings and that how could this person not be better known, especially when he's accomplished so much. His work is in the collections at the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the MFA in Boston, and he's shown all over the world. So I wanted to kind of see two central questions that I'm looking at in the film are, one, how could that be? What are the factors that prevented him from being better known? And then the other thing was to just look at the work itself and try to not really decipher it, where I'm going to actually know what did he mean by each thing in it, but just kind of understand where was he coming from, what was he trying to say to us. And in that process, I have had through Mike access to 1,000 works on paper and paintings, and so that's just one aspect of his background and his symbolism that I'm looking into. And there's so much more to his work to look at. One more paper that's going to look at a very specific aspect. The film is still in production. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to what remains of Atelier 17 and interviewing them. So if would welcome any feedback or questions about it. We can talk more about it. But for our last paper, okay, I'm going to do my best, Alvard. So I think this panel actually came about because last year at the conference in Houston, I met Alvard and showed her Martin's work, and she had never seen it before and was really impressed with it and interested to do something on it. So Alvard Semirjyan is associate professor in the chair of history of Armenian literature and literary criticism at Yerevan State University, Armenia. Her areas of professional interest encompass contemporary Armenian and world literature, literary theory, and history of Armenian criticism. And she is author of numerous scholarly works, articles, and monographs.
fantastic presentations we have together. And Rebecca, your voice sounds marvelous in this field. Thank you so much. And yes, first of all, let me thank you, Rebecca, yes, for
Can you speak louder or into the microphone? It's very hard to hear you.
for introducing me, Barooshian.
Let's project.
Is it good now?
It doesn't seem to be working, so maybe just,
Okay.
Talk
I'll try
loud.
to be louder.
yeah.
Yeah, for introducing me this wonderful artist last year. And thank you, Mike, for sharing with me all this information, materials about Barooshian. And today I'm going to introduce a paper about the bird image in Barooshian's artwork. The image of the bird holds special meaning in the works of Armenian surrealist artist, American surrealist artist Martin Barooshian with Armenian roots. In one of his interviews, Barooshian discusses the role of the bird stating, "Birds have a very special place for me and take on many different meanings in my works. Dissemination of the idea, arrival of peace, or alert of impending destruction. But I also have to present a successful composition, so sometimes a bird is just a bird." Essentially, this shows that for the artist, the bird is not only the ideological symbol or a compositional element, but also a means of expressing psychological emotions. In Barooshian's art, we have observed the meaning of the bird image through the following layers. Thus, to demonstrate the technical possibilities of movement in painting, Barooshian turned to the image of bird, creating the Bird in Flight series in 1950s. Referring to this series, he aimed to capture the poetry of flight, which is grace, ease, and function combined. He admits, I tried everything, from Greek classical painting to post-impressionism, Dadaism, and the style of the Italian futurists. None of these trends held my interest for more than a short span of time, except for the surrealists and futurists. The futurists fascinated me because of their investigations into the study of motion. The translation of these studies into works of art was significant enough to inspire me to put my own thoughts on paper. So those are the pictures from this series. Then, next, in Barooshian's art, the image of the bird frequently appears as a symbol, revealing hidden meanings associated with the bird phenomena. A prime example of this is the Birds of America series in 1970s, where Barooshian depicted birds that hold symbolic meaning and significance in this region. The advocate is a native to American shores. Spiritually, it symbolizes the appearance of angels where land, sea, and sky meet. Everything the power of three. So the next one is cedar waxwings. The bird is relatively rare to spot in U.S. American goshawk, known for their ferocity. Goshawks have traditionally been revered by a symbol of strength. Brown thrashers. This bird symbolizes perseverance and hard work. On a spiritual journey, the brown thrashers guide you to stay committed to your goals and work repeatedly to overcome obstacles. And And the last one, flying condor, revered as a sacred bird. The condor is often associated with spiritual significance, representing higher knowledge, wisdom, and connection between the earth and the celestial realms. Third, in Barooshian art, the bird often plays a central role either as the main subject or as a key compositional element, especially in his narrative-driven paintings. The bird frequently takes on the role of the main character, becoming a recurring motif across various works. For example, Venus Flytrap, Call of Ancients, The Conversation, Frightened Bird, Rites of Spring, Hunted Bird, Self-Portrait number 3 and 4, before and after shaving with gilded blue blades. So, what we see here, we investigated a little bit, and those are the gilded blue blades. And this is blades called Blue Bird. And Barooshian also had a painting Blue Bird. The lone bird, blue bird or lone bird. The lone bird tells the story of a sweet bird that is mistreated by other birds as they fly across the sky, leaving her alone and lonely. The lone bird is sad, feeling rejected and deeply confused. It has connection that highlighting the connection between the bird journey and the artist's own self-exploration. Because next we have important meaning of bird in Barooshian art lies in their mythological interpretation. In his work, we often encounter human-faced birds drawn from various mythological traditions. One notable example is the Huri-Puri bird, which appears in different forms. The first is an etching titled Huri-Puri bird, completed by Barooshian in 1948. This first finished etching. Another version of Huri-Puri bird is a monotype, oil on paper, from 1950. There is also a third piece, untitled, a monotype from 1949-1950, which, while not named Huri-Puri, is visually identical to the other two works. In Barooshian paintings, this character is often shown as a chrome barrier. These Huri-Peris are common figures in Armenian mythology and fairy tales, often appearing in the works of Armenian authors, with Huri-Puri likely being Barooshian's transliteration. In Armenian mythology, Huri-Peris are beings with the body of a bird and the form of a woman, acting as benevolent spirits. In some folktales, Huri-Peris transform into birds and given their wings and ability to fly. They are sometimes equated with angels in Armenian tradition. The etymology of Huri-Peri and Hresh Angel in Armenian may suggest a connection. According to the scholar Alishan, both words stem from the root hur, kara, fire, with her being a phonetic variation of hur. Barooshian also depicted a blue harpy, a creature from ancient mythology known as the bird-woman chimeras. Harpies in mythology are often fierce winged spirits with the appearance of women, usually depicted as birds of prey. In this context, another important work is Barooshian's painting commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, where the Sphinx is chosen as a symbol of death and rebirth. The Sphinx in this painting features an embodying complex, layered meanings. The symbolism of the painting, about this symbolism of this painting, Barooshian explained in 2014 article in Armenian Weekly. While many think of Sphinx in terms of Egyptian history and mythology, some of the earliest known Sphinx images and artifacts come from Armenian ancestors, the Europeans. Barooshian points out, I guess the Egyptians just had a better marketing team than we did. He chuckled. But in mythological terms, the Sphinx is a symbol of survival and rebirth. I can't think of a more appropriate statement to make on 100th anniversary of the genocide. One detail that stands out in this painting is the depiction of 3 birds above the head of the Sphinx. While we don't have exact evidence on the species of these birds, Barooshian's emphasis on symbolism is clear. Notably, the colors of the birds, black, white, and blue, are not random, as they hold specific meaning in his art. However, the full significance of color symbolism could be a subject for another study. Of particular interest in the identity of these birds, especially their possible connection to cranes. We believe this similarity is not accidental, as the crane is considered in Armenian culture to symbolize exile and the loss of homeland, a theme immortalized in a folk song associated with komitas. Fifth, the bird in Barooshian art is also a way to express deep feelings and emotions, subconscious and unconscious feelings. Russo mentions that Barooshian was often overwhelmed by melancholy throughout his life, which reflects the mental state of the generations that lived through the genocide. Certainly, there could be more extreme emotional responses, but the melancholy never left, even in times of joy. Thematically, he also returned to the concept of danger, warning, hunter and prey, warriors invading a peaceful kingdom, all of which I have taken as consciously or unconsciously addressing genocide. Russo also noted that Armenian art, culture, and mythology play a big role in Barooshian's work. Through this, we wanted to show the lasting strength and hopeful future of the Armenian people. At the same time, we believe Barooshian used Armenian myths to best show the mixed feelings of sadness, feelings of peace and destruction, creation and ruin, life and death. These emotions come through clearly in the image of the bird. Barooshian often used surrealism to show these opposing feelings. It's worth noting that Breton believed exploring the unconscious mind through art could free individuals from the pressures of modern society. In this sense, there seems to be a link between the artists and theorists who survived the Armenian genocide and surrealism, such as Arshile, Gorky, Anna Balakian, Levon Tutunjan, and others. This could be explored further. In this context, Barooshian uses the bird to show themes of metamorphosis, human-bird transformation, especially in his self-portraits. In early works, this change is shown more objectively, but in later works, it becomes more emotional and abstract. However, when we look at how the image has developed, it's clear that it keeps appearing in different ways. The deeper reasons behind this human-bird transformation can be understood through myths. In mythology, people often change into animals because of a curse. But in Armenian bird myths, turning into a bird is not a punishment, but happens by divine will, usually to fulfill a wish or to escape a difficult situation. This positive form of change comes from the socially and morally difficult state of the mythic figure, as well as the sadness from the loss of material and human values, writes Sarkis Halutunyan. The change follows this path: loss, hopeless search, grief, desperate longing, divine will, transformation. In Armenian bird myth, loss is linked with death, especially when the loss cannot be traced. That change is a way to cross the barrier between the living and the dead, and between this world and the next. This idea is at the heart of big bird myths. According to folk beliefs, the bird is a symbol of the soul separated from the body of a deceased person, connecting it with death and the afterlife. For the conclusion, the bird holds profound significance in the art of Armenian Surrealist, American Armenian Martin Barooshian. And he sees the bird not only as a symbol of various concepts like peace, destruction, or the spread of ideas, but also as a tool for conveying psychological emotions. And if we have time, I can switch on this music about the crane, Komitas.
Yeah.
Can we do that?
Yeah.
Is a very special year for us Armenians because this year is the 100th remembrance year of the Armenian genocide. I would like to dedicate my encore to the 1.5 million victims who left their lives during the First World War in 1915 and 16. And I will play a folklore song by Komitas, and with the name Karung, which means the crane.
Thank you.